And that's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, Politico national security correspondent Natasha Bertrand, and our table for the hour, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, Ron Klain, and former RNC chairman Michael Steele. I have to start with you, Ron Klain. The word spying means something, and if you're, I don't know, a tourist on the street, you could mix up the word spying with authorized surveillance, authorized by a FISA warrant signed by the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. But if you're the sitting Attorney General and you've actually sat as the country's Attorney General before, you don't mix up the word spying with the word authorized surveillance, authorized by a FISA application signed by the sitting Deputy Attorney General, do you?
No, you don't, Nicole. And it was a shame, I think, today to see Bill Barr, one of our nation's most respected lawyers, a two-time Attorney General, turn in his tortoiseshell glasses for a tinfoil hat. I mean, what he was talking about was really the craziest Trump conspiracy theories that are out there, that only the president's most fringe allies dared to advance. Now, what we know is that this has been investigated 5 times previously by Republican-led committees, and nothing came of it. The Justice Department has been defending its practices here. They've been investigated internally. They've been investigated externally. And indeed, when Senator Reid, in that clip you just showed, pressed the Attorney General, hey, do you have evidence for this claim? He said, well, no. So, I mean, it was irresponsible, flaky, and way out of right field.
I don't see it. I'm not sure. I hope it's flaky, Michael Steele. But I think I saw Republicans like Jeff Sessions under oath before Congress push back against Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, and people like that when they were calling for a second special counsel, when they were calling for these sorts of things. And I think that we may come to a point where clearing Trump on obstruction may be the least damage that Barr did as Attorney General.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't think anything that we heard from the Attorney General is surprising, at least not to me. Look, he has the job. He has the job for a reason, and he's doing the job that he was hired to do. And at the end of the day, that is to make sure that the president's narrative is not somehow derailed or stopped in some fashion. So he sits there in front of the committee and he throws out a very highly volatile, explosive word. He knew daggone well when he dropped the spy word on that table what it meant and what it would do. Yes, Donald Trump appreciated the moment because it's consistent with the other moments that Donald Trump wants to create around this narrative. And now he's got the help in the most important office right now in the land with respect to these investigations and finding out the truth to carry that narrative forward.
Joyce Vance, people like you have called William Barr an institutionalist. You've said give him the benefit of the doubt. In the last 2 days in public testimony, are there any new questions that you have, either on the process wherein he took a non-conclusion on the obstruction question from Mueller and steamrolled through, rendered his own judgment, something that anyone who read his obstruction memo could have predicted he would have done, and then today by inserting and injecting the word spying about the conduct of the American law enforcement and intelligence community, the most highly regulated and sort of walled-off process, this FISA court. And FISA applications, on Carter Page's case, I believe there was 1 and then 3 reauthorizations, and I believe Rod Rosenstein, who still sits in the DAG's office, signed at least a few of those.
You know, there have always been questions about Barr stemming from that now notorious memo that he wrote opining on the outcome of this investigation before he was even the Attorney General. So he's always had that problem. But I think everyone who loves the institution of the Department of Justice, myself included, I feel like a kid when you're just old enough to realize that there really isn't a Santa Claus. But you want so bad for there to be a Santa because you love Christmas so much, and you hold on to it for as long as you can. And it gets increasingly more difficult. And today with Barr, that's just become an impossibility. Attorney generals don't go into these hearings unprepared. They don't just walk in without some sometimes days of preparation and murder boards. And so the use of this term spying has to be a deliberate term, a term that was meant to really set people on fire. And Barr knows full well that there are checks and balances in place both at the FBI and in the intelligence community before this form of intelligence collection is used. It's arguable that he doesn't even have any sort of authority to review the way collection was done in the intelligence community. Certainly, he might have some oversight at DOJ, but that process has been done in Congress repeatedly. There is more review underway by his own Inspector General. So this notion that he now personally will look into spying really does the last little bit to shred his credibility.
Natasha, one of the most stunning things about suggesting that spying had taken place is that one of the men who authorized the FISA application sits a few steps away from him, Rod Rosenstein. Here's Rod Rosenstein defending his role in reauthorizing some of those FISA applications.
The FISA renewal that you signed, list for me the people who briefed you on the substance of that FISA renewal to go and spy on people.
So, Mr. Gates, here's one thing I think is important for you to understand. People can make all kinds of allegations publicly. I am quite confident about my conduct throughout this investigation. That matter is under review by the Inspector General. We'll see what the Inspector General finds.
Did you read the FISA application before you signed it?
I'm not going to comment about any FISA application.
So you won't say to this committee whether or not you even read the document you signed that authorized spying on people associated with the Trump campaign?
Well, I dispute your characterization of what that FISA is about, sir.
So there's Rod Rosenstein, Natasha, who is still in the job as the DAG. His replacement's been named, but Rosenstein is still there, disputing the notion that this was spying at all. His new boss, the Attorney General, today saying spying did occur. Awkward at best, no?
Yeah, and of course we saw Barr kind of change his story minutes later, saying that what he meant by spying was actually unauthorized surveillance. So that indicates that he wasn't necessarily even talking about FISA warrants, because FISA warrants are by definition court-authorized surveillance, that it's a tool that the intelligence community uses in order to monitor people who are potentially spies on U.S. soil. So I think, the Rod Rosenstein-Barr relationship is very odd, because Barr also invoked Rosenstein's name today to support his conclusion that the president did not obstruct justice, even though Barr himself, or Rosenstein himself, is extremely compromised as well, because he was a witness in the obstruction of justice investigation. Therefore, by clearing the president of obstruction, he kind of also clears himself. He's kind of out of the woods on that one. But I also think, going back to how conflicted Barr himself is, this is someone who not only wrote that 19-page memo outlining the reasons why the president could not, possibly be investigated for obstruction the way Mueller was investigating him. He also wrote to the New York Times saying that there was more of a foundation to investigate the Clinton Foundation and Uranium One scandal than there was to investigate the Russia collusion case. And he said that for the Department of Justice to not look into those allegations would have been an abdication of its responsibilities. So right off the bat, you're kind of getting a sense of how he's going into this job and what he actually thinks the proper investigation should have been, which apparently was the Clinton Foundation, was the Uranium One scandal, which has never been proven. And then he's coming into this role now saying he's going to review investigations that are already being done by the DOJ, by John Huber, who of course was appointed by Jeff Sessions to look into the Clinton matter originally. And it just seems like, that all of the conflicts are now coming to a head ahead of the Mueller report being released. He's kind of trying to change the narrative in a way that it does seem the spying comment was deliberate.
Donna Edwards, Democrats were largely hapless as Devin Nunes really shoved any integrity that the House Intelligence Committee had over decades and decades of trying to function above and sort of above and beyond the political debates. He shoved that committee through the wood chipper and turned it into an arm. Really, Nunes functioned as a Trump stooge. I think there was an open question about how much damage he did by declassifying material that the FBI director, Chris Wray, objected being declassified. It's now becoming clear how much damage Nunes did. What can the Democrats do now that they're back in control of that committee?
Well, I think what you've seen is I know that Chairman Adam Schiff has been trying to bring the committee back to some sort of regular functioning, but I think it's really difficult. I think once that damage has been done, it's not going to be repaired in a year or 100 days or even over a session of Congress to restore it to the way that it used to work. And here I think the damage with the Attorney General is that his memo, now we know, wasn't just a theory. It was a roadmap for how he would conduct himself from day one. And given that, I think Democrats are not going to have a choice but to really press forward, demand the Mueller report and all of the data that went into preparing it. And they also are going to have to say, you've got to come back. And there may be other witnesses who actually have to come back in order to bring that integrity to the process. And I think, you know, at this stage, Barr has made really clear, I'm going to be an engine for the President of the United States. I am not the Attorney General for the country. I'm not the Attorney General who's leading the men and women of the Department of Justice. I am the President's lawyer. He's already staked that claim, and we should assume that he's going to continue that.
Phil Rucker, we've been asking for the last few days, you and your colleagues have been asking, there's been reporting around whether Barr has shared the report with the White House. White House saying no, Barr in the last 2 days of testimony refusing to answer that question. Why aren't the questions about what the White House has shared with the Department of Justice? I mean, I worked in a White House where it was taboo. There was a years-long investigation. Emmett Flood actually came in and helped defend the Bush White House around the Attorney General scandal, and he is known for exerting a very vigorous executive privilege defense and trying to keep opaque things that Congress wants to know about. In that case, it was the selection of a lot of political folks for attorneys general. But why not ask about what the White House is telling Barr to say? Because this testimony over the last 2 days seems to be sort of the contamination of the Justice Department of politics that they haven't seen in 2 years under Jeff. I mean, I never thought that a Democrat would miss the Jeff Sessions run DOJ, but I think they might. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the testimony over the last 2 days has been music to the president's ears, and you have to wonder to what extent is Barr sort of reading and executing what the president and his lawyers at the White House want. We know one of the reasons Barr is the Attorney General is because Emmett Flood, the White House lawyer who had oversight of the Russia portfolio, recommended him, advocated for him with President Trump. Barr didn't know President Trump before this process began, and all of a sudden he's in there as the Attorney General. And so you want to know whether there have been any communication between Trump and Barr about doing an investigation into the origins of oranges of the probe. And it's interesting, just about an hour or two before Barr testified today, President Trump told reporters on the South Lawn as he was departing the White House for a trip this morning, we got to get to the bottom of this. You need to investigate the origins of this Russia investigation, and was really determined to push that point. And then a few hours later, the Attorney General pushes it for him.
Where is this coming from, though? I mean, is there some sense? I mean, do you think Barr has some visibility into the IG report? I mean, to go out to drop a nuclear bomb, to basically say, I don't have any evidence, but accuse the intelligence agencies of spying on a presidential campaign. I mean, both scenarios are pretty troubling. Either he's as daffy as president, I'm going to get to the oranges of this, or he's playing on some sort of insider information.
Yeah, I doubt there's inside information. I mean, the other clip you showed was Mark Warner, who's one of the most mild-mannered members of the Senate, sometimes to the consternation of his Democratic colleagues, and who's also one of the Gang of Eight. And if there was evidence of illegal spying, the Justice Department had a legal obligation to brief Senator Warner as one of the members of the Gang of Eight. And he says he's flabbergasted by this. So if that information was in the department, and somehow Attorney General Barr has inside information about it, then the department's failed its obligation to notify members of the Intelligence Committee like Senator Warner. I think Attorney General Barr was playing a game with words today, trying to curry favor with the president, trying to stay on his good side, I guess. We've seen what happens to high-level administration officials who get on his bad side. We're on a firing For whatever reason, he did this. But I think in doing this, as Donna alluded to, as others have, he crossed a line, a big line, that's going to do permanent institutional damage to the Department of Justice.
You agree?
I do. To me, the idea that this process, going back to the selection of the special counsel to where we are right now, was somehow some nefarious, gamed out strategy that goes back into the dark recesses of the 2016 campaign. I don't know. Look, I do politics. I don't know anybody in politics that's that good that can for 3-4 years. So, what we're seeing is the narrative unfolding the way the president wants the narrative to unfold. And he's got his minions in place to, put that out there and to keep using the keywords that he's been using so that when whatever drops, we can get onto the delegitimate train and ride that sucker as hard and as long as we can, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's ever mattered, that no matter what the report said, short of Donald Trump is the next best thing to sliced bread, it's got to be delegitimized and made irrelevant to the American people, especially before a 2020 reelect.
Natasha, I went back and looked at what he could possibly be talking about, and I pulled up the New York Times report on Crossfire Hurricane, which was the first public reporting about what that investigation into the early Trump campaign looked like. And it would be the sort of thing that you would think they would hold out as the example of restraint. And a lot of criticism went to law enforcement for not making this public. Let me just read some of this to you to take everyone back in time. The facts, had they surfaced, might have devastated the Trump campaign. Mr. Trump's future national security advisor under investigation, as was his campaign chairman. One advisor appeared to have Russian intelligence contacts. Another was suspected of being a Russian agent himself. In the Clinton case, Comey has said he erred on the side of transparency. But in the face of questions from Congress about the Trump campaign, the FBI declined to tip its hand. And when the New York Times tried to assess the state of the investigation in October 2016, law enforcement officials cautioned against drawing any conclusions, resulting in a story that significantly played down the case. You can make the case that there was collusion, that the FBI was trying to cover up what was a very active counterintelligence investigation.
Right, and I think that's the thing that we always have to come back to, right? I mean, if the FBI really wanted to sink Donald Trump's campaign, if this was really a coup, then they would have leaked it. But they actually did the opposite. They discouraged the New York Times from publishing anything that would imply that the campaign was being investigated for its associations with the Russians during the election. So, but at the same time, of course, they publicized the fact that Hillary Clinton's emails were being reinvestigated. And so they kind of reopened that case just days before the election, while at the same time keeping the Russia probe very, very secret. And, I asked Andy McCabe, last month, the former deputy director of the FBI, whether he regrets that, whether he believes or how he would respond to the criticism that they effectively sank Hillary Clinton's campaign while keeping the Trump campaign's ties to Russia a secret from American voters. And he said, look, this was a very sensitive counterintelligence investigation. We couldn't say anything about it because we would risk derailing the whole thing. The Clinton investigation was already kind of, set. It was determined. Comey had closed it. And he said this was the way we had to do it. And I've also been chatting with people familiar with the FBI's decisions in 2016, and they say, look, investigate away. We have nothing to hide.
Natasha, thank you for spending some time with us. We were grateful to track you down for the top of the show today. And just to recap, Trump investigation kept secret. Hillary Clinton investigation, big public splash. Keep that in mind as you watch the clips tonight, folks.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.